So, colleagues, academics, friends and family, very warm welcome to Phil Cavendish's inaugural lecture. My name's Stella Bruzzi and I am Dean of the Arts and Humanities faculty, and my role is a very minor one. If you look at the UCL, the kind of brief that we all get sent, I've got to talk for 1 or 2 minutes, which means I've almost used it up anyway. Then I hand on to Richard, who's got a much more important role, which is to introduce our speaker, Professor Cavendish, and to outline here the importance, give an outline of his career and the importance of his research. And then Phil is going to give this wonderfully entitled lecture, The Return of the Ghost. And I'm hoping I'm very worried about people there in the Gustav chart that you can see. But The Return of the Ghost, an excursion to the Kunstkammer of early Soviet colour film and photography. It is customary not to have questions at the end of an inaugural lecture, just in case you're wondering. But I'm delighted to say that we've got someone who's giving an appreciation. Julian Gaffrey, hello. Will come down later to give an appreciation to the lecture, and then there is a reception downstairs in the South Cloisters. So now I'm going to, very important role, in case the fire alarm goes off, yes, I always say this, I would go out that way, because at the bottom of there is that you have to join those stairs anyway, okay? So I'd go out that way, despite what it says. But that is the end of my very important role. I'm going to now hand on to Richard.
Thank you, Stella. So good evening, everybody. My name is Richard Mole, and I'm the director of the School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to Phil's inaugural lecture. So Phil has been at SEAS for 35 years now. Having started his PhD on Yevgeny Zamyatin and the literary stylization of Rus in 1989. While still a research student, he was made a temporary lecturer in Russian before being offered a permanent position in 1996. He was then promoted to senior lecturer in Russian literature and film studies in 2005, to reader in Russian and Soviet film studies in 2015, and finally to professor of Russian and Soviet film studies in 2022. So his evolving academic titles over the years reflect his sort of shift towards his interest and expertise in film studies, and it's in this field that he has developed an international reputation as one of the world's leading authorities. And so without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Cavendish and very much look forward to his inaugural lecture. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming. Before I begin, I'd just like to express my thanks to Stella and Richard for their very kind words of introduction, and also, of course, to Julian, who's agreed to give the response or appreciation to my lecture. Many of you here will know that Julian and I go back a long way. In fact, we go back so long that we've almost forgotten where we started, I think. But anyway, he was the supervisor of my doctoral dissertation, and over the years has very much been a mentor to me, as well as being a fabulously supportive academic colleague and friend. And I'm delighted that he's able to be with us. My subject this evening is the history and ontology of Soviet colour film and photography between 1935 and 1953. The choice of these dates will be explained in due course. This is a subject that has fascinated me for many years now, some would say for far too many years, but in many respects it's the logical culmination of my long-standing interest in the visual language of film. My lecture this evening has been conceptualized as an excursion to a museum, an imaginary museum, which is dedicated to this phenomenon. At the outset, it must be admitted that the construction of this museum is not yet complete. In fact, only a few rooms are currently open to the public. Furthermore, the exhibits are not necessarily in the best of conditions. They have been kept in dark vaults for the best part of several decades, in some cases nearly a century. After a great deal of trouble tracking them down, the museum curators have given them a good dusting for the purposes of display in their polished glass cabinets, but some of the items have been incorrectly dated. There is little in the way of commentary to explain their genesis, and the museum offers no overarching narrative that links the exhibits together. In short, an explanatory audio-visual guide is still very much a work in progress. The curators of the museum have faced innumerable and in some cases insurmountable challenges in terms of categorizing their exhibits. In many respects, they might be regarded as the scattered remnants of an ambitious but only partially successful archaeological excavation. As is commonly the case with such remnants, in one or two cases, objections might be raised in relation to their authenticity. They exist, therefore, in a curious state of limbo and might be regarded as the filmic equivalents of the artifacts typically encountered in a Kunstkammer, or cabinet of curiosities. They are exotic by virtue of their rarity and certainly intriguing in terms of their genesis, but also potentially haunting as far as their contemporary resonance is concerned. My excursion will lead you through certain rooms in this museum. Each room has been curated to reflect certain tendencies associated with the early history of colour film and photography in the Soviet Union. The excursion is planned to last for approximately 1 hour. I hope you find it informative and entertaining, as well as intellectually stimulating, but of course there will be a questionnaire at the end for those of you who are not satisfied. Okay. The first room in this imaginary museum is called the Room of Internment and Exhumation, the death of Stalin and his resurrection. And it consists of two main exhibits. The human subject in both will doubtless be familiar to you, although not perhaps in this particular guise. Here we encounter Joseph Stalin, 4 days after his death, lying in a coffin in the Pillar Hall of the House of Unions, which is located in the center of Moscow, prior to his transfer with full state honors to Lenin's mausoleum, where his body will be interred and embalmed. The first exhibit on the left is a color photograph taken by Dmitry Baltermants, a photojournalist working for Ogonyok, the Soviet illustrated weekly magazine. The second item, to the right, is a frame still from a feature-length documentary entitled State Funeral, or Государственные похороны in Russian, which was directed by Ukrainian filmmaker Sergei Loznitsa in 2019, although it was assembled on the basis of archival footage shot in Moscow and elsewhere in the Soviet Union between the day of Stalin's death on the 5th of March and his funeral on the 9th of March, 1953. In both cases, the material in question was withheld from the public. Baltermants's photograph was never published in Ogonyok. Indeed, the editors permitted no color images of the funeral in the 3 issues of the magazine dedicated to the event in subsequent weeks. Neither has the photograph featured in any of the published albums of Baltermants's work, or even, as far as I've been able to establish, in retrospectives of his oeuvre in recent years. As far as Loznitsa's documentary is concerned, the footage was edited from materials that were themselves intended for inclusion in an officially commissioned feature-length documentary. This was presented at a closed screening in the Kremlin at the beginning of April 1953, but it was never released, evidence perhaps of the rapidity with which the great leader's successors in the Politburo had moved to distance themselves from his regime. Entitled The Grand Farewell, Великое прощание in Russian, this documentary was the culmination of a staggeringly ambitious logistical exercise. Apparently approximately 100,000 meters of footage from various locations around the Soviet Union, recorded by 180 camera operators. A sizable proportion of this footage was filmed in color. If released, it would have constituted a stunning illustration of the epic dimensions that Stalin's cult of personality had acquired by the time of his death. At 2 hours and 15 minutes, Loznitsa's presentation of this material is considerably longer than the 65-minute version screened at the Kremlin in 1953, but also the 43-minute version broadcast for the first time on Russian television in 2012, with an introduction by the historian Edvard Radzinsky. My lecture opens with these images not merely by virtue of their rarity, but also because they illustrate the paradoxes and ironies that characterize the early history of colour film and photography in the Soviet Union. The fact of their existence testifies to the ideological weight attached to colour as part of the Stalinist project. In fact, the acquisition of a commercially viable colour film technology was identified as an urgent priority for the Soviet state from the mid-1930s onwards. With the passage of time, this technology became a key component in the official construction, some might say manipulation, of Soviet reality during this period. Bearing in mind the ideological hostility that dominated relations between the Soviet Union and the United States and West Germany in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, it might be considered an irony, perhaps even a grotesque irony, that the construction of this reality depended on film technologies that had been developed in precisely these two countries. Baltermantz's photograph, for example, was taken with the Soviet equivalent of Agfacolor, a German monopack process first released in 1936, and the patents for which had been acquired by the Red Army as a trophy of war from the IG Farben factory in Wolfen, eastern Germany, in the early months of 1945. These patents established the scientific foundation for all the Soviet colour film stock manufactured for cinema and still photography after the war. Likewise, according to Loznitsa, a significant proportion of the documentary material in The Grand Farewell was also shot with Agfacolor, but with certain sections apparently filmed using 35mm Eastman Kodak, which had only been introduced in the United States in 1950. It might be regarded as a paradox that images of Stalin's funeral in colour were regarded as sufficiently sensitive politically to require their withholding from the public. But this concealment serves as a convenient testimony to the difficulties of establishing with precision the timelines associated with colour film in relation to the Soviet Union. Like any body of knowledge, but for slightly different reasons, the history of colour film technology exists in a state of continual flux. And this is due to the fact that the material basis on which such a history might be attempted is periodically augmented by the discovery of evidence that has lain dormant for decades, its potential significance overlooked, or has fallen victim to political turbulence and has therefore been censored or confiscated, or in some cases literally buried underground for long periods of time by the very creators themselves, who feared persecution and arrest, or has temporarily disappeared from view by virtue of displacement and emigration. Such materials have often languished for years in long-forgotten trunks, in family attics or cellars, or occasionally on commercial premises, or in one case, and I'm thinking here of the 4 hours of 16mm footage shot in Agfacolor by Adolf Hitler's partner, Eva Braun, a disused aircraft hangar in Maryland, USA. One such discovery outside Russia, which occurred as recently as 2016, pertains directly to Stalin's funeral. The footage in question belongs to Michael Manhoff, an army major serving as a military attaché with the US Embassy in Moscow, which was shot on 16mm Kodachrome from a balcony of the embassy on Makhovaya Street, not far from Red Square. This material, preserved in canisters marked secret and confidential, was discovered by chance in an empty property outside Seattle by Douglas Smith, the historian, writer, translator, and one-time Russian interpreter for Ronald Reagan. No booing, please. Contained in these canisters was additional footage that Manhoff had filmed with Kodachrome in various parts of the Soviet Union, as well as a substantial collection of Eastman Kodak slides, all of the material dating from the early 1950s. There is no denying the historical significance of this discovery, but its uniqueness has been exaggerated. In an interview, Smith refers to having been stunned when first encountering the images on the grounds that, in his own words, colour photography at the time was, and I quote, not accessible to the general public, especially not in the Soviet Union. This is an incorrect assertion in relation to amateur photography in Europe and North America, but also in relation to the Soviet Union, where the proliferation of colour images in feature films, documentaries, and print publications during the late 1940s and early 1950s was a relatively standard occurrence. The crucial questions, however, relate to the genesis of this phenomenon and the purposes for which colour film technology was deployed in the services of the Soviet state. With these questions in mind, we move to room 2 in my cabinet of curiosities. The museum curators have named this room the Stalinist project, Colour Film as Consumer Good and Visual Attraction, 1935 to 41. I'll give you 2 seconds to laugh at that. Exhibit item 3, Fifer Pig, Fiddler Pig, and Practical Pig. The 3 protagonists from Walt Disney's Three Little Pigs will doubtless be familiar to many of you here, or perhaps not, as the case may be. Difficult to know, bearing in mind the generational gap. Nevertheless, their enormous popularity in the Soviet Union during the mid to late 1930s may come as something of a revelation. Three Little Pigs had been released with enormous success in the United States in 1933, but the film was screened for the first time in the Soviet Union only in February 1935 as part of the first Moscow International Film Festival. Three Little Pigs triggered a veritable sensation. The film was enthusiastically reviewed in the press, including in Pravda, and at the end of the festival, the Disney studio was presented with a special prize by Sergei, who was head of the jury. This official accolade resulted in the animation being authorized for general release and screened in cinemas throughout the Soviet Union during the next 2 years. In turn, this release spawned a series of state-sponsored commercial spin-offs. Exhibit item 3 is one such example. It's the wrapping paper for a bar of chocolate, part of a new range of confectionery introduced in 1936 by the Red October factory in Moscow, the largest enterprise of its kind in the Soviet Union. This wrapping paper has become something of a collector's item in recent years because of its novelty value in terms of Soviet commercial design. Unwrapping the bar of chocolate reveals pop-up figures, which, as you can see, are also modelled on the characters from the Disney animation, and that's item number 4. Similarly styled illustrations accompanied the publication of the Russian translation of Three Little Pigs, the story based on the filmic narrative, by Sergei Mikhalkov, a director who 8 years later would achieve fame, if not notoriety, as co-author of the Soviet national anthem. This translation first appeared on the 16th of April, 1936, in the pages of Pionierskaya Pravda, a newspaper aimed at children and young teenagers, and it's exhibit item number 5. It was also subsequently published as a separate book edition. Endearingly, but in the process ignoring the musical talents of the 3 porcine protagonists, Mikhalkov named them Nif Nif, Nuf Nuf, and Naf Naf. And I'm going to ignore the punning potential of these names in English. According to the animation artist Ivan Ivanov Vano, the song Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, originally composed by Frank Churchill, was on the lips of every Moscow schoolchild during this period. This was doubtless encouraged by the release of a gramophone record by Len Kino that had been taken directly from the soundtrack of the film and featured this song in English on the B-side. As you can see from exhibit number 6, the design of the label of this record also borrows directly from the animation. The massive popularity of Three Little Pigs in the Soviet Union can of course be explained by its comic inventiveness and memorable soundtrack. However, from the point of view of officials in charge of the Soviet film industry, the sensational quality of Three Little Pigs lay predominantly in the fact that it was one of the first animations to take advantage of the 3-color Technicolor process, which had become commercially available in 1932, and to which Walt Disney had exclusive rights as far as animation was concerned. Praise for the film went right to the top of the Soviet political establishment. Stalin himself had been offered a sneak preview of the animation in advance of the festival and had expressed admiration. Stalin's direct personal interest may well explain the publication of an editorial in Pravda on the 3rd of March 1935, calling for the urgent acquisition of a viable Technicolor equivalent in the Soviet Union. The year 1935 indeed marks the beginning of serious financial support for the acquisition of a Soviet 3-color process and the emergence of an official discourse that would emphasize the joyful, uplifting, and life-affirming value of color film. This discourse reflected a general shift away from the austerity and self-sacrifice of the 1920s and early 1930s towards an emphasis on consumer abundance, material comfort, and personal gratification. This had been signalled by Stalin's speech to the first All-Union Congress of Stahanovite workers in November 1935, during which he had extolled the virtues of Soviet reality and claimed that life has become better, comrades. Life has become more joyous. The policies of Anastas Mikoyan, the People's Commissar for Internal and External Trade, especially after his 3-month visit to the United States in 1936, were subsequently dedicated to the generation of an impressive array of consumer goods as part of this new rhetoric. Black caviar, crab meat, Frankfurter sausages, spinach puree, canned goods of various descriptions, condiments, soy sauce and tomato ketchup, no less, breads, desserts, cakes, jams, ice cream, a range of alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages. As you can see, this is bringing out my inner flight attendant. Exotic varieties of tea and coffee, and confectionery. A related development was the proliferation of commercial advertisements in state publications and the erection of massive hoardings and billboards designed to promote these goods on the sides of residential buildings and office blocks in Moscow and other cities. From this perspective, it might be argued that colour film functioned as something akin to a consumer good, evidence that the Soviet Union could compete technologically with the West, not only in terms of heavy industry, but also into the spheres of the consumer economy and entertainment. Throughout the 1930s, the decoration of public spaces on designated holidays and during state-sponsored festivals attested to the increasing importance attached to displays of bold and vibrant colour. On occasion, this bordered on the kitsch. The documentary footage in colour of the physical culture parade that took place on the 18th of July 1939, for example, which was directed by Alexander Medvedkin and entitled Blossoming Youth, or Цветущая юность in Russian, offers ample evidence of this. The viewer encounters not only the vibrant, if not flamboyant, hues of certain costumes, so exhibit number 7 captures the highly theatricalized display performed by Uzbek athletes, but also the clothing and accoutrements, most prominently umbrellas, of the spectators themselves, as you can see in exhibit item 8. It goes without saying that the black and white newsreels and still photography of the period capture nothing of this chromatic abundance. Room number 3, as you can see, is called the Masked Political Code, Moscow in Agfacolor, October 1939. The exhibits in this room propel us ceremoniously towards the corridors of power and the inner sancta of Russian imperial and Stalinist era statecraft. Their presentation serves to highlight the international dimension of colour film, but the rationale for their inclusion is characterized by a significant degree of irony, for reasons which will shortly become apparent. Exhibit items 9 and 10 consist of 2 Agfacolor slides taken from different positions along a staircase known in Russian as the Paradnaya Loznitsa. This staircase functions as the main entrance to the large halls and reception rooms that form part of the interior of the Grand Kremlin Palace. This staircase may be regarded symbolically as the threshold of Imperial Russian and Soviet state power. Since its construction between 1837 and 1849, this palace had served as the venue for a variety of formal occasions. The 2 images in question were taken on Sunday the 22nd of October 1939 at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon. They are unusual, if not unique, in several respects. Firstly, they were taken by a visitor to the Soviet Union, very possibly the first occasion on which a foreigner had been granted permission to take photographs in an area of the palace not usually open to tourists, whether foreign or Soviet, and certainly not during the period when the slides were taken. Secondly, they constitute only the second occasion since the invention of photography that this staircase had been photographed using a technology that did not involve artificial manipulation by means of tinting, toning, or hand colouring. Thirdly, and perhaps most surprisingly, the images in question were taken by a photographer who was intimately connected to the Nazi political establishment. Indeed, the entry visa for his visit had been personally requested by Hitler, and the colour slides that resulted, including these images from within the Grand Kremlin Palace, were privately projected for the benefit of the Führer within 2 months of the photographer's return to Berlin. In total, this foreigner took 20 Agfacolor slides during his excursion to the Soviet Union. As well as the 4 views of the palace interior, they include 5 images of state buildings and churches located within the Kremlin grounds. Exhibit item 11, for example, shows part of the river-facing exterior of the Grand Kremlin Palace, with the Borovitskaya Tower visible in the distance. And exhibit item 12 shows the Church of the 12 Apostles, which is situated on Cathedral Square within the Kremlin grounds. The visitor's colour portfolio during this excursion features several landmark sites outside the Kremlin: a view of Red Square looking towards the State Historical Museum, St. Basil's Cathedral, the Bolshoi Theatre, the Dynamo Sports Stadium, the Theatre of the Red Army on Suvorovskaya Square, and the 17th century Church of the Life-Giving Trinity at Ostankino. Fourthly, the 2 Agfacolor slides of the Paradnaya Loznitsa feature sections of an artwork hanging in the antechamber at the top of the staircase that possessed an enormous political significance. The artwork in question is entitled Reception of Rural District Elders by Tsar Alexander III in the courtyard of the Petrovsky Palace in Moscow. It was painted in 1886 by Ilya Repin, one of Russia and Ukraine's most revered 19th century artists. The name of the photographer in question is Walter Frentz. Exhibit item 13 shows him filming with his Arriflex camera on a tripod on the parapet of the Grand Kremlin Palace during the same October visit. The name Walter Frentz may not speak to many of you here, but he is a relatively well-known figure in the history of German cinema. His reputation is based largely on his work as cinematographer for Leni Riefenstahl on 2 of her most controversial films, Triumph of the Will, which dates from 1935, and Olympia, her 2-part documentary dedicated to the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And item 16 to the right, you can see a working moment from that film. Apart from his collaborations with Riefenstahl, Frentz directed a number of documentaries himself during the 1930s. Furthermore, after the Nazi invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, apparently on Riefenstahl's recommendation, he became increasingly involved in the production of newsreel propaganda for the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. In recent years, however, thanks to the archive painstakingly assembled by his son, Hans Peter, who forced his father before his death to confront the moral guilt of his association with the Nazi regime, it is Frentz's work as a photographer working in black and white and colour that has increasingly attracted attention. Frentz has been described variously and inaccurately as Hitler's personal photographer or the eye of the Third Reich. But it is undeniable that from 1939 onwards he moved in circles closely connected to the nexus of political power. He took many informal photographs of Hitler, for example at the Berghof, his mountain retreat near Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, where Frentz apparently taught Eva Braun how to film with 16mm Agfacolor, and also at Wolfschanze, or Wolf's Lair, as it was known, which was located near the village of Görlitz, now Gierwash in Poland, and served as Hitler's military headquarters prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. It is important to stress that none of Frentz's colour slides of Hitler were printed or exhibited during his lifetime. Frentz's connection with the Nazi political establishment were well known among officials stationed at the German embassy in Moscow. In several respects, especially bearing in mind the privileged access granted to him, it might be speculated that Frentz's portfolio of images in October 1939 was to some extent shaped, if not directly curated, by the embassy. Such influence could only have been engineered in the aftermath of the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, better known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which had been signed on the 23rd of August 1939 and which Frentz himself had filmed. It is important to emphasize in this regard that Frentz traveled to the Soviet Union under official auspices as part of a delegation that had been assembled by the German Foreign Ministry to discuss the evacuations that had proven necessary after the German and Soviet invasions of Poland, respectively, on the 1st and 17th of November 1939. Frentz's visit lasted 12 days, during which, in addition to his 20 agricolor slides, he took around 200 photographs in black and white. One subset of images has clearly been taken from a viewing platform that forms part of the roof structure of the House of Government, a large residential complex constructed in 1931 across the river from the Kremlin and reserved for important state officials and party functionaries, among them members of the security services. Exhibit item 15 is an agricolor slide that shows the view from this building across the newly constructed Bolshoi Kamenny Bridge towards the Kremlin. Another photograph from the same vantage point, but this time in black and white, is directed towards a site, the political sensitivity of which Frentz himself may not have been aware. Exhibit item 16, which has been taken from his contact sheets, reveals the devastatingly empty space where once had stood the Cathedral of Christ our Saviour, in its time the largest cathedral in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but one demolished on the 5th of December 1931 as part of Stalin's anti-Orthodox campaigns. As you can see, well, hopefully, work has only just commenced on its planned replacement, the so-called Palace of Soviets. Elsewhere in Frentz's portfolio, we encounter subtexts that seem deliberately designed to send coded signals to Hitler. One such subtext is potentially present in the series of statues, in the images of statues and buildings that are associated with Russia's military victories over enemies in the past, as well as levels of Soviet preparedness in the present. One of the color slides of the Grand Kremlin Palace, for example, which is exhibit number 17, has been taken in the Hall of St. George, the state room which, in the words of art historian Oleg Tarasov, functions as a sanctified shrine in glorification of Russian arms. Exhibit number 18 shows the replica tank that forms part of the constructivist architecture of the Frunze Military Academy, which is located in the Khamovniki district of Moscow. As you can see, hopefully, the blocks of concrete that function as a quasi-pedestal for this tank have words engraved on them that cite from Stalin's speech to the 16th Congress of the Bolshevik Party on the 27th of June, 1930, and I quote, "We do not seek an inch of foreign territory, and not an inch of our own territory will be relinquished to anyone either." In this context, it's important to bear in mind that key officials in the German embassy in Moscow, several of whom were fluent Russian speakers, and one of whom, Gustav Hilger, had been born in Russia and by 1939 had spent most of his life there, were extremely nervous about Hitler's intentions in relation to the Soviet Union. Not only were they privately opposed to Operation Barbarossa when it was eventually launched in June 1941, but 3 years later, one of the key officials at the embassy, the very ambassador himself, Friedrich Werner Graf von der Schulenburg, to give him his full title, took his opposition several stages further. On the 23rd of October 1944, Count Schulenburg was sentenced to death for his role in the failed attempt on Hitler's life, the von Stauffenberg conspiracy, that took place at Wolf's Lair on the 20th of July, 1944. In relation to visual images as masked political codes, the Repin painting that falls within the purview of Frentz's gaze, and indeed appears to constitute the main focus of his gaze, belongs to a similar category of significance. Reception of rural district elders. I might as well actually show you why not, so you get a chance to look at it. Reception of rural district elders was commissioned to celebrate the coronation of Tsar Alexander III and depicts a meeting that took place in the courtyard of the Petrovsky Palace on the 21st of May, 1883. The chief purpose of this event lay in the symbolic expression of the unity of the Russian Empire and the Tsar's identification with the Russian people, or narod in Russian, as well as the empire's minority peoples. Not only was Repin's painting an official commission, but its dimensions, some 15 feet wide and 10 feet high, were devised specifically to fit the wall of the antechamber that faced the staircase in the Grand Kremlin Palace. In his book, Framing Russian Art, Oleg Tarasov explores the symbolic significance of the composition, specifically the arrangement of figures on the canvas. But the actual hanging history of the painting remains something of a mystery. It is well attested that the painting was displayed in the antechamber until 1924, when it was replaced by a work significantly more in tune with the revolutionary pathos of the early 1920s. This was a painting entitled The Opening Ceremony of the Second Congress of the Comintern in the Uritsky Palace in Leningrad, which had been completed that year by Isaac Brodsky, one of Repin's pupils. 3 years later, however, this epic work was in turn removed on the grounds that several of the figures depicted, most prominently Leon Trotsky, had been condemned as enemies of the people. There were some 600 people allegedly painted in this painting, so it takes some spotting. At this point, the trail goes cold. Between 1927 and 1953, our knowledge of the fate of Repin's painting relies on incidental clues in sundry films, paintings, and postcards. In 1933, for example, the state printing agency Gaznak produced a number of postcards in color featuring the interiors and exteriors of the Grand Kremlin Palace. One of them shows the view from the bottom of the staircase, and as you can see, Repin's painting is faintly visible in the background. This is exhibit item 20. The post-1945 period yields more tangible evidence, most prominently a painting by Soviet Armenian artist Dmitry Nalbandyan, which was officially commissioned in 1947 and depicts Stalin descending the staircase at the culmination of a banquet on the 24th of May 1945 to celebrate the victory over Nazi Germany. In both cases, unlike Frentz's Agfacolor slide, the painting is visible only in the distance and therefore not easily identified. On the basis of the postcard, it might be speculated that at some point between 1932 and 1934, very probably as part of the extensive renovation of the palace interior undertaken by architect Ilarion Ivanov-Shits, which included, it should be noted, the construction of the film auditorium in which Stalin was later to view Three Little Pigs, the Repin work was restored to its original position. The political resonances associated with its rehanging were not lost on some foreign dignitaries. The German foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, during a diplomatic visit to the Soviet Union on the 28th of September 1939 to finalize certain details of the Non-Aggression Pact, noted the presence of the painting and commented on the abandonment of world revolutionary values in favor of more conservative tendencies that in his view it represented. It's important to note that Repin's painting was removed from the antechamber on the orders of the Politburo in the immediate aftermath of Stalin's death. This suggests that the painting was very much associated with his legacy. It now resides in the Tretyakov State Gallery. The next room in my cabinet of curiosities is dedicated to the first tentative steps in Soviet color photography during the mid to late 1930s. While Walter Frentz was taking Agfacolor slides of the Grand Kremlin Palace, his professional counterparts in the Soviet Union were not exactly resting on their laurels. It must be acknowledged, nevertheless, that experiments in the sphere of color photography were a relatively marginal preoccupation. This is not explained by lack of scientific knowledge or expertise. Experiments in color photography stretched back at least 1 decade before the October Revolution. The most illustrious practitioner in this respect is Sergei Prakudin-Gorsky, a pioneering inventor of a 3-color process for film and photography, whose glass plates from 1906 onwards were printed in magazines and journals, but also in the form of postcards. Another notable exponent was the prose writer and dramatist Leonid Andreev, whose self-portraits and family photographs were taken using the Lumiere brothers' autochrome process, which had been introduced in 1907. The challenge in the 1920s and 1930s lay not in the science of color processes per se, but rather their rationale for a political system geared to the mass production of images for agitprop purposes and for a photographic community committed in its vast majority to documenting the transformations, collective endeavors, and revolutionary dynamism of ordinary everyday life. Colour processes in the domain of photography were associated with requirements that were ill-suited to agitprop or avant-garde artistic agendas. Abundant illumination, relatively long exposure times, which necessitated static subjects, the complexities of chemical development procedures, which were difficult, if not impossible, in the absence of the necessary materials, the vast majority of which had to be imported, and the expense associated with printing. For these reasons, certainly during the 1920s and early 1930s, colour photography remained the preserve of a few. The relative marginality of the phenomenon can be gauged by the photographic exhibitions that took place in 1928, 1935, and 1937, where the official catalogues of entries reveal only a tiny percentage of works submitted under the colour category. By and large, the purveyors of these images were not household names within the Soviet photographic canon. There are exceptions, but these were either photojournalists, better known for their work in black and white, or camera operators working within the genre of newsreel and documentary film, or researchers working in scientific institutes with a specific remit to investigate the technology of colour processes. For the overwhelming majority, until the mid-1930s, colour experimentation was a sideline, a private hobby, or a purely academic exercise. An important representative of this select group is N.A. Tikhomirova, who is frequently described in the literature of the period as an engineer, but was in fact a researcher employed at the Institute of Scientific Research for Film and Photography, or NIKVI, to give it its Russian acronym. The extent of Tikhomirova's obscurity can be gauged by the fact that her first name and patronymic are not recorded in the catalogues of the exhibitions in which she participated, and neither are they indicated in the articles she contributed to the specialist journals of the period. For example, Soviet Photography, Sovetskoye Foto in Russian, which was the leading publication dedicated to Soviet photographic art during the 1920s and 1930s. There appear to be no surviving portraits of Tikhomirova either. In this sense, she has endured a fate not entirely dissimilar to many of the women working within the domain of Soviet photographic journalism, few of whom are known, unless they happen to feature in the works of male professional associates. One such legendary case is Yevgenia Lemberg, a photojournalist best known as the woman with the Leica, after Alexander Rodchenko's 1934 photograph of the same title, but someone often confused with her sister Regina, also a photojournalist, both of them daughters of the camera operator Alexander Lemberg. Yet Tikhomirova is a seminal figure in several respects. Firstly, her expertise in the science of the Carbro process, which was a relatively complicated method of transforming colour-separated negatives into positive images on pigmented paper, and the principles of which she explained in an article published in the April 1938 edition of Soviet Photography, holds the key to understanding how colour photographs were produced and printed in the Soviet Union at this time. Secondly, Tikhomirova was a practicing photographer in her own right, and one whose experimental works in colour were included in two important exhibitions during the 1930s. Exhibit item 22, for example, which is entitled Roses, Rozy in Russian, was selected for inclusion in the exhibition of works by masters of Soviet photographic art, which opened on the 24th of April 1935. This photograph was published in the official catalogue of the exhibition, which was edited by Rodchenko, and subsequently featured on the front cover of the November 1936 issue of Soviet Photography. This was only the second time in the history of the journal that a colour photograph had been privileged in this way. Roses was also one of 7 works submitted by Tikhomirova to the first all-union exhibition of photographic art, which opened in Moscow on the 10th of November 1937 to coincide with the 20th anniversary of the October Revolution. Only 19 works by 4 photographers appeared in the colour category. For her services to the development of colour photography, Tikhomirova was subsequently awarded a Diploma of the Second Order, a prestigious official accolade. This was followed by the inclusion of several works as part of an event organised on the 3rd of April 1939 at the House of Scientists in Moscow to commemorate the centenary of photography's invention. Tikhomirova also appears to have been actively engaged in the process of political lobbying as a representative of the Soviet photographic community. In the December 1936 issue of Soviet Photography, for example, on the occasion of the extraordinary 8th All-Union Congress of Soviets, which formally approved the Soviet constitution of that year. She is described as editor-in-chief of an album of color images presented to party and state leaders by Soyuz Photo, the state agency responsible for the production of photographic propaganda at this time. It is important to point out at this juncture that while the association of color photography with official state ideology is a typical feature of the Stalinist era, its manifestations assume a variety of guises, both public and private. In the public sphere, they're illustrated by Dmitry Debabov's portrait of Vyacheslav Molotov, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, who is pictured here on the 1st of October 1939, presiding over the opening ceremony of the All-Union Agricultural Exhibition, which is exhibit item 23. 4 years in the making, and 2 years behind schedule, this exhibition was nevertheless an important showcase event for the Soviet state, both domestically and internationally. It attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors during its first months, including many foreigners, among them photojournalists, although the images taken were in black and white. Debabov's photograph, by contrast, was taken with a German Bernpol 3-color camera, which had been imported the previous autumn precisely for the purposes of experimental testing. His portrait of Molotov was subsequently included in the November 1939 issue of Soviet Photography. In relation to the private domain, it is illustrated by exhibits number 24 and 25. These items belong to a series of portraits taken in black and white and color by Vladislav Mikosha, who was better known at the time as a camera operator working within the sphere of documentary film and as a photojournalist working for the government newspaper Izvestia. The photographs in question are dedicated to the Bolshevik grandee Emelian Yaroslavsky and his grandson Roman, and they've been tentatively dated between 1939 and 1941. Yaroslavsky was a high-profile political figure in the 1930s. As a Bolshevik of long-standing and impeccable revolutionary credentials, his notoriety resided primarily in his militantly anti-religious views, his virulent anti-Trotskyism, which led to his designation in the early 1930s as Stalin's attack dog, and his authorship or co-authorship of 3 ideologically canonical texts: A History of the All-Union Communist Party, Bolsheviks, a short course, which was initially serialized in Pravda in September 1938, what the British satirical magazine Private Eye would have called an Ars Likan biography of Stalin, about Comrade Stalin, A Tovarishche Stalinya, which was published in 1939, and a political biography of Lenin, which followed 1 year later. All were required reading for existing and aspiring party members. Interestingly, Yaroslavsky has been photographed by Mikosha in a quasi-private rather than public capacity. The grandson in question was the product of the marriage of Yaroslavsky's daughter Marianna, a sculptor by profession, to the documentary filmmaker and photojournalist Roman Carmen. As we will see in a minute, Carmen himself is present in several of the images that form part of the series, but only in black and white. The building in the background of exhibit number 25 is a state-owned dacha, which, according to the historian Sergei Shramko, was treated by Yaroslavsky as something akin to a personal fiefdom. It accommodated a grand piano, a Rolls-Royce, a collection of expensively acquired works of art, and a well-stocked garden, which Yaroslavsky himself, a keen gardener, had zealously nurtured. According to Shramko, on one occasion, Yaroslavsky was reputed to have ordered 3 to 4 truckloads of horse manure from the People's Committee of Defense, apparently signing off his request with a cheerful gardener's greeting. Such was Yaroslavsky's enthusiasm that in 1937 a lilac shrub was named after him by the horticulturalist Leonid Kolesnikov, a former student of the renowned plant biologist and geneticist Ivan Michurin. And for those of you prepared to ignore the current boycott, which I'm guessing is not many of you, this shrub is available via Russian websites for the princely sum of 5,000 rubles, which is not an awful lot of money. It's very likely that the origins of Mikosha's series lay in a private commission. To my knowledge, the images have never been published. But those seeking explanatory details will struggle to locate them in Mikosha's own memoirs. Indeed, he makes no mention of his pioneering experiments in colour photography at all, either in the first censored edition, which was published in 1967, or the second unexpurgated edition, which appeared in 2005. Neither do they feature in the 2007 documentary on Mikosha's life and career, a film entitled Vladislav Mikosha, The Man Who Halted Time, Vladislav Mikosha, Остановивший время in Russian, which was directed by Yevgeny Tsimbel and Gemma Firsova, Mikosha's second wife. This omission is curious, bearing in mind the fact that Mikosha is alleged to have taken at least 100 colour photographs at the All-Union Agricultural Exhibition of 1939. 2 of these images were included in the exhibition catalogue that was published the following year. Exhibit item 26 is taken from this catalogue and is rather excitingly entitled Mechanization Pavilion. And a further 17 served as the basis for a series of postage stamps issued in October 1940 by Gaznak in commemoration of the exhibition, and that's exhibit number 27. Apart from these works, Mikosha enjoys the accolade of the first Soviet photographer to enjoy a solo exhibition dedicated to his oeuvre, and this took place in the Moscow House of Cinema in April and May 1940. Of the 120 works on display, around 1/6 were photographed in colour, among them the first colour portrait, wait for it, of the Soviet film star Lyubov Orlova, which is exhibit item 28 in my cabinet of curiosities. This was apparently taken during the filming of Volga Volga, a musical comedy directed by Orlova's husband, Grigory Alexandrov, and released in 1938. It is a testament to the historical significance of this photograph that it was published in the October 1940 edition of Soviet Photography. And I'd love to leave it up there, but unfortunately we move on to something more exciting. Room 5. At the risk of stating the obvious, the photograph that constitutes exhibit item 29 in my cabinet curiosities is a portrait of Mao Zedong. It is possibly the first colour photograph of Mao to appear in print in any nation of the world. This image was taken by Vladislav Mikosha on the 1st of October 1949 during the ceremony to announce the creation of the People's Republic of China. It was selected as the front cover of Aganyok for its 8th of January 1950 edition. 7 other colour images by Mikosha, including the back cover, also appeared in this issue, although the series contains a large number that never appeared in print at the time, among them this one, the item to the right, which serves as exhibit item 30. There is a revealing anecdote associated with the publication of this front cover. Mikosha had travelled to China in the autumn of 1949 as part of a filmmaking unit working for the Central Studio of Documentary Film. The result of this unit's endeavours, a 96-minute documentary in black and white entitled Victory of the Chinese Nation, Победа китайского народа in Russian, was released on Soviet screens the following year. According to the reminiscences of the director, Leonid Varlamov, Mikosha was summoned by Chinese state officials shortly after publication to explain why the mole on Mao's chin, just below his lower lip, was not visible. On making inquiries, Mikosha discovered that the editors, having suspected that the mole was the product of a defect in the film stock, decided to airbrush it out of existence. Mikosha's photographs were taken with the Soviet equivalent of Agfacolor. As I've explained previously, the acquisition of these patents facilitated the proliferation of colour images in the Soviet print media, although not newspapers, from 1945 onwards. The routine occurrence of this phenomenon, however, conceals the fact that in percentage terms, the photographs published at the time constitute only a small fraction of the images actually taken, mainly because the costs of reproduction were still prohibitively high and the technical quality relatively poor. The existence of this hidden reservoir poses dilemmas for the curators of my imaginary museum, in the sense that unless the images were published contemporaneously, or unless there is reliable documentation, precise dating can be a hazardous enterprise. Many colour photographs from this period are dated only vaguely and in certain cases inaccurately. Furthermore, in some cases, their authorship is not easily ascertained and their titles are the product of informed guesswork. And this is why the room in which this and similar items have been housed is called the archaeology of the Soviet colour photograph. The issue of chronological uncertainty characterizes the archival collections of many Soviet photographers working in color during this early period, and Mikosha's archive is no exception. This is illustrated most intriguingly by his expedition to Lake Ritsa, a stunningly beautiful body of water positioned at an altitude of 950 meters in the mountainous region that forms part of Abkhazia in the southern Caucasus. I'm going to show you, even though it's in slightly advance of my discussion, images from both. This expedition produced a series of color photographs that conventional curatorial wisdom dates to Mikosha's involvement in an unusual filmmaking commission, the only instance of its kind in the history of Soviet documentary cinema, in the sense that it was based on a scenario apparently composed by Stalin himself. The film in question, a 15-minute documentary entitled On the Shores of Lake Ritsa, Na ozero Ritsa in Russian, does not feature prominently, if at all, in the annals of Soviet documentary cinema. Indeed, in the absence of the circumstances that gave rise to its genesis, the film might be dismissed as a relatively anodyne travel film, the sole function of which lies in the promotion of the lake as a desirable tourist destination. Few would have guessed that towards the end of the 1940s, Lake Ritsa served as the location for one of Stalin's favorite holiday retreats. Recently published documents have confirmed the construction of 2 state dachas along the shores of this lake after the end of the Second World War. The first, designated Dacha number 5, was constructed along the northern shore in 1947 and was open to the public. The second, designated Dacha number 11, which was considerably more extensive and luxurious, was completed in 1948, a few kilometers away, but designated a closed or forbidden zone on the grounds that it served as Stalin's main residence. Mikosha's account in the 2005 edition of his memoirs, the chapter is tellingly entitled Abduction, or Pохищение in Russian, accentuates the secrecy and urgency of the operation. A phone call in the middle of the night to his Moscow apartment, the arrival of a GAZ M20 Pobeda, or Victory, motorcar driven by NKVD agents to expedite the transfer of him and his fellow camera operator, Boris Makasiev, to Vnukovo Airport for an overnight flight to Sochi, the provision of a Douglas S-47 Skytrain military transport plane, I'm not a plane spotter, by the way, which formed part of the Soviet Union's official air fleet courtesy of the USA's wartime Lend-Lease program. The long journey by road from the Black Sea coast through narrow ravines and across high bridges to the lake itself, the swift perusal of the 1.5-page scenario that had been written and signed by Stalin, the 7 days that had been allocated for completion of the commission, and the availability of only 800 meters of color film stock, although more would be forthcoming courtesy of a special consignment delivered by the same plane the very next day. Mikosha reports that despite various logistical difficulties and an exceptionally acute degree of nervousness, the mission was successfully completed within the designated time frame. Once the film had been edited and the soundtrack added, the minister in overall charge of the film industry, Ivan Bolshakov, expressed his approval and offered his congratulations. But several days later, word reached the ministry that Stalin, having been screened the film at his lakeside residence, had expressed profound disappointment. Everyone involved feared for their lives. It turned out that an injudicious editing cut had removed part of the voiceover narration, as a result of which the viewer was informed that the lake was bordered by only 10 species of subalpine tree, rather than the 60 specified in Stalin's scenario. Fortunately, to the relief of all concerned, the missing frames were located on the cutting room floor and rapidly reinstated. The precise date of these events is given as June 1952. Mikosha's account is entertaining and informative, yet there are reasons to believe that several of the facts underpinning the narrative are misleading. The first resides in the dating of the events in question. As the opening credits make clear, On the Shores of Lake Ritsa, the documentary film, was released in 1950, not 1952. Furthermore, Stalin's long-standing head of security, General Nikolai Vlasik, whom Mikosha mentions having warmly welcomed him on his arrival, was no longer in position in June 1952, having been removed from his duties the previous month. 7 months later, in fact, for alleged participation in the infamous doctor's plot, Vlasik would be arrested The following year, he was sentenced to 10 years internal exile on charges of embezzlement and abuse of power. Bearing in mind the time that had elapsed between the events in the memoir, it's possible that Mikosha was confusing On the Shores of Loznitsa with another documentary on which he was employed as cameraman, namely Pioneer Summer, Pionierskaya Leta in Russian, which was also shot in color and also included scenes of the lake, but was directed by Tamara Lavrova and released in 1952. Such an error might be regarded as relatively trivial, but it does nevertheless possess consequences for the accurate dating of his photographs in color. In theory, the series could have been taken in either 1950 or 1952, but direct comparison of the two bodies of material, in particular the identities of the tourists who appear in both, offers compelling evidence in favor of the earlier date. In one scene from the documentary, for example, the viewer is presented with a dancing platform by the lake that hosts several figures seated on a bench to the right, and the dancing figure of a woman dressed in grey in the center, which is item 33. Now, I would point this out to you, except the laser doesn't really work very well on this screen, is what I mean to say. Hopefully you can see the woman in the grey, but also the bench to the right, in particular the gentleman with the white jacket or the white shirt, who is common to both images, although obviously the colour photograph, having been digitally scanned, is clearer than the film still. Exhibit items 33 and 34 show an identical idyll of collective farm workers enjoying an open-air picnic by the side of the lake. In relation to this scene, it's worth drawing attention to the fact that the photograph from the series has probably been digitally scanned the wrong way round. This is suggested by the reverse arrangements of figures. For example, the male figure with the fair hair, braces, and wristwatch, and the man in the background with the dark hair wearing a white shirt, who were shown on different sides of the man who is raising his glass in toast, and hopefully you can see that fairly clearly. But also the reversed positions of the wharf and the motor launches visible in the background. You'll be pleased to know that room 6 leads to the exit. It's entitled The Return of the Ghost. Establishing accurate timelines for the scattered vestiges of Soviet color photography and cinematography in their earliest manifestations might be regarded as something of a fool's errand, in the sense that color film is a fugitive and therefore elusive phenomenon. Color film stock degrades over time due to the chemical properties of the dyes within the celluloid, but also those that have been applied as part of the printing process. Furthermore, different filmic materials degrade at different rates and with different consequences in terms of their chromatic properties. Digitization contributes an additional layer of complexity in the sense that the restoration of a photographic or cinematographic original involves the application of a color correction process based on a series of calculations relating to the degree of that degradation. This is not an exact science. The correction process is not invariably shaped by subjective judgments reflecting the aesthetic prejudices of the present rather than the color discourses of the past. The quest for authenticity, if such a thing is possible, cannot be based on published materials because the print technology available at the time was still relatively impoverished. Investigations into the aesthetic discourses of the past are further compromised by the increasingly ubiquitous phenomenon of colorization by digital means of materials originally produced in black and white. One recent example of this tendency in Russia has been the colorization of black and white films dating from the 1930s. Among them, Grigory Alexandrov's Happy-Go-Lucky Guys, Veselye Rebyata in Russian, released in 1934, and Volga-Volga, which I've mentioned to you before. Igor Lopatyonok, the director-producer in charge of these restorations, has defended his project on the grounds that young audiences are indifferent to films projected, broadcast, or streamed in black and white. He's also drawn attention to the painstaking research undertaken into the color discourses of the Stalinist era, arguing that today's Russian viewers deserve to become acquainted with the true color of Lyubov Orlova's eyes. It's difficult to know on what such painstaking research might be based, since all the potential evidence of these discourses, paintings, posters, postcards, clothes, uniforms, etc., will themselves have fallen victim to the ravages of time and therefore constitute only approximations of the reality of the 1930s. This does not, of course, mean that Mikosha's 1938 portrait of Orlova is a true or accurate likeness. The lighting arrangements, the dyes applied as part of the Carbro process, the pigmented paper imported from abroad to produce the print, the exposure time selected by Mikosha, and the printing technology available to the editors of Soviet photography at the time, as well as the digitizing process that has facilitated online access to the relevant issue of the journal today, will almost certainly, to some extent, have distorted the color of those famous eyes. So while it can be asserted with confidence that color photographs and documentary films are a more reliable guide to the chromatic landscape of the period than materials in black and white, they are only an approximation of that landscape, or perhaps better to say, an artistic impression, rather than a scientifically accurate record. Further issues arise in relation to the re-emergence of historical film materials in color in the present. Let us return to Mikosha's portraits of Emilian Yaroslavsky. Exhibit items 35 and 36 show two further photographs from the series, one in black and white and one in color. Their similarities in terms of composition and the impressive quality of the color, bearing in mind the time when the series was ostensibly produced, may well arouse suspicion. Not only are the images clearly digital scans, but we cannot be entirely confident that the image in color is not a digitized forgery based on a black and white negative or positive. Without access to the archive in which the series has been preserved, in other words, the archive of Roman Carmen, it is difficult to verify the photograph's authenticity. Another image from the series, which shows Mikosha preparing to photograph his subjects with his camera on a tripod, and with Roman Carmen positioned to his left, could potentially serve as evidence, but it is insufficiently distinct to identify the camera in question. It's my guess, but only a guess, that it is a German Bernpol camera. I'm just going to track back to the previous images. If exhibit item 36 is a forgery, what consequences would follow? Which of the images seem more contemporary as a result? To be sure, there are historical markers in both portraits: Yaroslavsky's shirt and tie, his haircut, moustache, and glasses. But the popular conception of color film as a relatively recent technology, as opposed to black and white as a relatively archaic technology, might well prove misleading to the viewer. Does the presence of a floral bouquet in color give rise to an impression of immediacy, tangibility, and timelessness? Finally, consider the paradox of a figure who symbolized the repressive mechanisms of the Soviet state during one of its most destructive periods, clutching such an innocent and delicate product of nature. Can we say that this is the photographic equivalent of Hannah Arendt's Banality of Evil? And does not Yaroslavsky's resurrection in the shape of a nurturing gardener, for those not familiar with his political past, evoke the presence of an enduring danger or threat? If, to reach the language of metaphor, we are encountering a ghost who has returned from the dismal depths of the past, what grave and haunting message is being communicated to us? Thank you.
I will now like to seamlessly, Professor Julian Graffy has come down to offer his appreciation of the lecture. Yes, we need. Can I pass you the microphone?
What do I do? Hold it?
You can attach it. Do you want me to?
I would love you to.
Yes. So, bad news night presenter. Not able to do it. Anyway, there you go.
Right. I want to start by saying what a great pleasure it has been for me to watch and listen to this lecture. There are so many exciting things about it that I obviously won't be able to refer to more than a few of them. But a key point that I like to make at the start is that Phil's talks primarily about looking, that it helps us to see things. And this is a feature that is not as widespread as you might imagine in writing about visual culture. So it's great to sort of, as I say, to be able to think about what we see in the context of what we've been hearing. Another thing I want to say is that it's very wittily constructed around this concept of an imaginary museum, a museum which is conceived out of the knowledge and the intellectual resourcefulness of its creator. And that puts Phil in the company of the legendary French writer André Malraux, whose own preoccupation with such a conceit goes back to 1947. It's a very clever heuristic device because it makes it possible to bring closely together images that have not previously been considered in tandem, and thus, of course, to shed new light on all of them and on their cultural, intellectual, and historical context and implications. But of course, in order to be able to do this kind of thing successfully, you need an exceptionally broad and deep culture. In this case, you need to know a great deal about Soviet culture, Soviet history, Soviet politics, Soviet society. And that leads me to remind you that scintillating intellectual fireworks of this kind are possible only if you've done the years and decades of reading and looking and thinking. If you know enough to know when and whether to trust the material, and when and where to embark on the kind of informed detective work that we have seen in evidence here. We've also seen evidence of an extraordinary range of allusion and an extraordinary variety of sources displayed in the lecture. Something else I'd like to mention is something I've always been in awe of in terms of Phil's scholarship, which is his comprehensive understanding of cinematic and photographic technique, which enables him to explain to us both how things are made, which is, of course, a key concept in Russian culture, a key concept of the Russian formalists of the 1910s and 1920s, but also to insinuate to us how and why they provoke the effect on us that we experience. A further consequence of hard intellectual work over years is that sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes you make connections or make discoveries that cast the familiar into new light. And so in this context, I want to reiterate the name of Walter Krentz, whom I first heard of when Phil started enthusing to me about his work. But these photographs, these extraordinary Moscow Kremlin photographs of Krentz that we've seen today, lead us somewhere very interesting. They lead us to the ideological context of everything that we've been listening to. We probably had all known about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact before we came to the lecture, the Pact of August 1939. But the consequences of this secret pact, such as the removal from Soviet screens of Sergei Eisenstein's film Alexander Nevsky as too anti-German, anti-Teutonic, were of course a great embarrassment to Soviet authorities both during and after the Second World War. And yet, as Krentz gives us further evidence of, the links between the German and Soviet regimes went back further, went back into the 1930s, and they were far more pervasive than is usually remembered. Representation of them, of course, became forbidden in Russian cinema for decades. You did not see Russian films about the way in which the Russians and the Germans had collaborated throughout the 30s in training and in all sorts of, and in science and in all sorts of ways. And in that sense, there was a very brief window in the 21st century, in the 2010s, when this subject could, for a brief period, be addressed. There's a very interesting film by a director called Alexander Mindadze, which is called Milihans Dorogoy Pyotr, Liebster Hans, bester Piotr, dear Hans, dear Piotr. And this is about German engineers working as experts, as Spezi, in a Soviet optics factory in the months before the outbreak of war. Now, such a film would, of course, be completely impossible because the Germans have reverted to their traditional role in Russian cinema as Vrag Nomer Один, as enemy number one, and there is a torrent. I'm not sure how many of you have experienced this to the extent that I have, but there is a torrent of new films and serials, TV serials and internet serials about the Second World War currently for obvious reasons. And there the Germans, there is no nuance at all in terms of the representation of the Germans, or indeed the representations of certain Central and Eastern European countries as well. So in this context, the fact that Krentz was a photographer with links to the highest ranks of Nazi society, that he'd worked with Leni Riefenstahl, that he produced newsreels for the Wehrmacht and taught Eva Braun how to use Agwacolor, is a really important discovery. Maybe for some people it's a rediscovery, but for us to see these close links, as I say, makes the kind of ideological underpinnings of the material that Phil has shown us, that started indeed with Stalin, it draws our attention to their significance. And the final ideological point that I'd want to make is that it's actually very difficult not to see, while you're watching this presentation, not to make connections between then and now, between the 1930s and recent history about Russia, from Putin's orchestration of his walks through the buildings of the grand buildings of the Kremlin, which mirror Krentz's photographs, Nalbandian's painting, and also indeed his creation of palaces just as Stalin created a palace in a dacha in a private zone on Lake Ridza in Abkhazia, and had his places in Crimea as well. So, of course, famously, Vladimir Putin created his palace in Gelendzhik in a forbidden zone, which it took Alexei Navalny's team's secret photography to reveal to the Russian public. So there are lots of ideological implications in this material, which it's very interesting to think about. If there was time, I would want to talk to you about the floral subtext of the material. Or what one might call the gardening subtext, because there are flowers throughout this presentation, but we must remind ourselves that the gardener number one in this period was Stalin himself, and that Stalin both used imagery of gardening in his speeches, but also was famously represented as a gardener in a very important film of the immediate post-war years called The Fall of Berlin. In a 1934 speech, Stalin said, Bolsheviks must be gardeners. They must cultivate new peoples. So that metaphor that he was using is, I think, particularly relevant in the context of all the flowers, all the roses, all the bouquets, all the gardening that we have seen going on here today. But as I've said, there isn't time to talk at length about gardening. So in conclusion, I just want to say that I've followed Phil's career with great interest and admiration, and to my immense intellectual benefit for what really is now, I'm afraid, decades. And I've been delighted by the reception of his earlier books, his Mining for Jewels, Yevgeny Zamyatin and the literary stylization of Rus, which is where he and I started having intellectual discussion, Soviet mainstream cinematography, the silent era, and then The Men with the Movie Camera, the poetics of visual style in Soviet avant-garde cinema of the 1920s. These are books that are constantly praised, but they're also, and it's probably more important, they are constantly quoted. They're constantly quoted because people are drawing upon the knowledge and the insights that Phil has displayed, which, as I reiterate, has emerged out of dedication and hard intellectual endeavour over many, many years. I'm absolutely certain that the book which he's working on now, which this will form part of, will have the same kind of reception. And like everybody, I'm looking forward to its appearance and I'm looking forward to learning from it. So I'll just end by saying that I'm extremely grateful to have been asked to come to this lecture. I'm extremely grateful for the chance to have praised Phil to you. And I'm sure that we are all in agreement that this was a wonderful experience, and thank you very much.